Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. Again, my name is Franziska Roesner, and as Eric said, I work broadly in security and privacy. My lab at the University of Washington focuses on topics ranging from security for emerging augmented reality platforms to web privacy to smartphone permission models and the Internet of Things. In all of that, one thing that I think is really important is building systems that are really grounded in the needs of real users. So the goal of my talk today is to illustrate the importance of understanding and designing for end users. And I'll do that through a set of case studies with journalists and lawyers. So I'll start with a story where this didn't work so well. Some of you may know this story. When Edward Snowden first reached out to journalist Glenn Greenwald, it took Greenwald months and several other people's involvement to finally get encrypted email set up. It was something that he had intended to do but never gotten around to. In his book, he said it's complicated, and it just never became pressing enough to stop other things and focus on that. Now, regardless of your other opinions about Snowden, the fact that in this case, two otherwise motivated communication partners had such a hard time setting up a secure channel should concern those of us working on building security tools. So the central thesis of this talk and of much of the work that I do is that we can't really build effective and usable security and privacy tools without actually understanding the specific user populations that we're building those tools for. And that means understanding their security needs and mental models, and also the constraints that they face in trying to use and understand the tools that we build. We know, for example, that expert users and non-expert users have different perceptions of security and privacy. So these researchers, for example, found that using antivirus software ranks highly on the list of online safety practices that non-experts think about, but it doesn't actually appear on the experts list at all. And there are a lot of other cases where we can find discrepancies like this. So there are a few reasons for these discrepancies. One might be that we just haven't done a good enough job as experts reaching end users with our advice. In other cases, it might be that we actually don't understand end users very well and we're building the wrong tools for them. So ultimately, one of the first steps to bridging this gap is to actually study our users. And as I mentioned, this is something that I like to do in general, work that bridges systems and users. And this is often an iterative process. So in the rest of this talk, I'd like to illustrate this general approach with this case study of journalists and more recently lawyers. Let's start with journalists. So as we heard from Tom yesterday, journalists are clearly a user population that can benefit from security tools. Targeted attacks against journalistic organizations are common, and journalists face real risks in trying to protect the identities of their sources and report on sensitive stories. In the last couple of years that I've talked to journalists, I've learned that journalists take this duty of source protection extremely seriously. So they clearly have a motivation to use security tools. And there are many security tools that exist and that some journalists do use. But unfortunately, in practice, we often see limited use of these tools, even among investigative journalists like Greenwald, who we might otherwise expect to need these tools the most. So that begs the question, why not? Why don't motivated user groups use these tools? Is it just a matter of usability, which we know is a hard enough problem as it is? Or is it perhaps that we are building the wrong tools entirely? So to answer these questions, we really need to dig deeply into specific user groups and understand how they work and what they need. With journalists, for example, although as a technical community, we often think of journalists as potential beneficiaries of the tools that we build, I realized when I started talking to them that I, and probably others in the technical community, didn't actually really understand how journalists work and what they need. So the goals of our recent work have been twofold. First, to really study the general professional practices and computer security-related needs and mental models and constraints of first journalists and then more recently also of lawyers, in order to ultimately inform the designs of security and privacy tools that better meet the needs of these populations. So this has been a collaborative process among experts in the journalism, usability, and computer security communities. And so far, this work has consisted of 4 parts. First, we conducted interviews with individual journalists to understand their practices, needs, and mental models. And we then broadened that to consider journalists within their organizational context. So we also talked with editors and IT staff members. From those findings and from other findings, we then actually built something. So we designed and prototyped a more usable encrypted email tool that we call Confidante. And then, as I mentioned, this is often an iterative process, so we then closed the loop and took that tool back to real users and evaluated it with lawyers and journalists, and also used that as an opportunity to dig even more deeply into the specific email-related security concerns and use cases for these professions. So I'd like to walk you through the different stages of this research process. As I said, we started in 2014 with interviews with individual journalists. Our goal here was really to understand the journalistic process better, the general professional practices of journalists, particularly in their communication with sources, and their security concerns, needs, and mental models. So we talked with 15 journalists working at major journalistic organizations in the US and France, and these journalists covered a variety of different topics and talked to sources of a variety of different levels of sensitivity. One of the most important things I think that we found is that the choice of communication technology when a journalist communicates with a source is often driven by the source, not by the journalist. The goal of the journalist is to collect information from sources, and so anything that gets in the way of that is a problem. Journalists are afraid, for example, of scaring away sources by asking them to use specific technologies like encrypted email or encrypted messaging. In the words of one of our participants, journalists will rely on the source to identify their own threat model. And the journalists will typically go with whatever the source feels comfortable doing, rather than stepping in and being paternalistic about the sensitivity of the situation and the choice of communication technology that would be appropriate. To make matters worse, many sources are not tech savvy. So we even heard in the extreme about sources who might not even have email addresses. So what this means is that when we're building tools for journalists, we shouldn't just be thinking about the journalists, but also about the sources with whom they're communicating. And that's a much more nebulous population, and ultimately means that we need to be building better tools that work for everyone. Another finding that surprised me personally is that long-term sources are common. Journalists will build up a relationship with a source over time, and a sensitive source might not immediately share sensitive information until that relationship has been established. So that means that the tools that we build need to take into account the fact that there may be a change at some point in the nature of the relationship. By the same token, truly anonymous sources are rare. A source that is quoted as anonymous is usually known to the journalist and often the editor of the organization. And that's partly because of the need to verify information. So one journalist told us, if I don't know who a source is and my editor doesn't know who they are, then I'm just not going to use the information that they give. So while there have been high-profile, well-known cases of anonymous document drops that have motivated great tools like SecureDrop, at least in the interviews that we conducted, it seems that this really is not the common case. And so we shouldn't be focusing on building technical tools for that uncommon case. So talking with journalists themselves really only gives us part of the picture. In the next set of interviews, we wanted to understand better how journalists work within their broader organizations and how that affects their technology choices. So we were specifically interested in differences between individual journalists and organizational stakeholders like editors and IT staff members in terms of security-related concerns and perspectives. So in 2015, we talked to 7 editors and 7 technologists at major journalistic organizations in the US. Overall, we found that there are, as you would expect, both similarities and differences between the perspectives of these different stakeholders. Generally, everyone shares this concern about source protection, and by extension, the reputation of the organization, because that is correlated with the ability to recruit sources in the future. But one of the differences that we saw was that the organizational stakeholders were much more in tune to some of the more mundane organizational security concerns like password practices and phishing, which individual journalists weren't really thinking about. A couple of other concrete examples, the individual journalists we talked to often talked about using third-party services, often cloud services, to do their work. So that included things like Google Drive or Evernote, or using their iPhone to do voice transcription. And although these people were otherwise concerned with security and source protection, at least in their conversations with us, they didn't really identify the potential risks of using third-party cloud providers. But their organizational colleagues did. So for example, one editor told us that they'll walk through the organization and notice that someone has Evernote open, and we'll say to them, be careful that you're not putting source phone numbers in there. If you want to put something non-sensitive in there, that's fine, but be careful with source information. And part of this may be because some of this functionality is just not robustly available in alternative tools. A related concern that organizational stakeholders constantly voiced was finite resources. So, for example, the IT departments at these organizations don't have the resources to support every tool that an individual journalist might come across and want to use, security or not. One IT staff member said, it's a case of who owns this, who controls it, and who's going to pay for it. Related to this conversation, something we heard several times that is maybe a bit counterintuitive is that the IT departments were hesitant about using open source tools because they wanted to be able to pay a company to maintain and train people on a tool rather than use something that has an indefinite future and that might stop being maintained after they've gotten everyone in their organization trained on it. Okay, so stepping back for a minute, some of these organizational concerns are, of course, not unique to journalistic organizations. There are some ways that journalists are very unique, like the independence with which they work, but other concerns appear in all sorts of organizations. For example, one editor that we talked to mentioned an experience with a lawyer who said, yeah, I've heard about this PGP stuff, I'd like to use it, but he was working at a big law firm and the IT department there basically said, no, sorry, we just don't support that. That was a similar story to what we had heard at the journalistic organizations. There are a couple of other reasons that lawyers are similar to journalists in ways that made them interesting for us to look at as a next user group. That includes their genuine motivation to protect the information of their clients. And also the fact that despite that motivation, studies have shown that lawyers have generally been slow to adopt secure communication technologies like encrypted email. So I promise at this point that I will come back to telling you more about our findings about lawyers a little bit later in the talk. But at this point, I want to tell you about a tool that we built. So I mentioned that I also really like building tools, and we've done that in a lot of different contexts. But here we wanted to build something that was specifically motivated by the potential needs of journalists and lawyers. And so that something was usable encrypted email. In our earlier interviews with individual journalists, we learned that email was commonly used. Everyone we talked to used email to communicate with some or even all of their sources, and that the interoperability and widespread adoption of email made it an appealing communication tool for them. But unfortunately, we know that usable encrypted email is a hard and long-standing challenge. The 1999 Why Johnny Can't Encrypt paper recently won the USENIX Security Test of Time Award. And as Nikita said in this excellent tweet, that's probably because Johnny still can't encrypt. So why did we think that we could do any better now? Well, one of the key challenges with usable encrypted email is often key management. And there's a few things that are a little bit different when we went back to look at this problem. One difference is that it's now common for people to informally authenticate their contacts' social media identities. So when people are using Twitter, they're always making the judgment, is this actually Alice's Twitter account? People, of course, are not perfect at making those judgments, but in practice, these are judgments that they're making all the time. Second, some of you may be familiar with Keybase. Keybase is a public key directory that leverages this phenomenon of social media identities. So you can post your public key, and then you can link your Keybase account with your other social media accounts. And you do that by essentially posting a cryptographic proof to those other accounts. And what this means is that it's reduced the problem of saying, do you believe that this is my key, to the problem of whether you believe that this is my Twitter account. And that's a judgment that you're already making today. And in fact, I'm here to tell you that, yes, this is my Twitter account. Another property of this system is that it requires that an adversary compromise all of the associated accounts in order to replace my key. So Keybase itself is also not perfect, but it presented an interesting new angle for looking at key management for encrypted email. So what we've done is we've prototyped an encrypted email client that we called Confidante. I'll show you some screenshots from the prototype. And it leverages Keybase to handle key management transparently under the hood. So you can see that a sender will specify both the recipient's email address as well as their Keybase account. It turns out actually that linking these two accounts is a little bit non-trivial, but it's something that we're still thinking about. And then the Confidante client handles PGP encryption transparently to the user. Our prototype is built on top of Gmail, but Gmail only sees the underlying encrypted message, which is only decrypted in the Confidante client itself. And Confidante also supports signatures, and it appends this sort of identification UI at the bottom of signed messages, including the Keybase account and any associated social media accounts. So at this point, we've completed the Confidante prototype, and we're planning to release the code for community evaluation in the coming months. But once we had built this tool, we wanted to close this loop and take it back to real users, journalists and lawyers whose potential use cases had motivated the tool in the first place. And in doing this study, our goal was twofold: to first evaluate the tool itself and the design decisions we had made in that tool, but also to use it as a way to learn more concretely and dig a little bit deeper in the encrypted email specific use cases and needs for these populations. So we brought in 7 Seattle area lawyers and 7 Seattle area journalists and 8 Seattle area lawyers into our lab to do an encrypted email task. About half of the participants used our Confidante prototype, and the rest used Mailvelope, which some of you may know. It's an existing encrypted email browser extension that integrates with Gmail. So in terms of the Confidante tool itself, at the highest level, what we found is that using Keybase for key management was really promising. One of the best things about doing the study was seeing how easy it was to use Confidante. So many people said things along the lines of, using this is no different from using regular Gmail. Another person said, this is the easiest PGP experience I ever had. I could imagine sending a short thing to sources and trusting that they could actually set this up themselves. We also saw that people did not make the same types of errors that they are able to make with tools like Mailvelope. So for example, with Confidante, it's impossible to accidentally send an unencrypted email. We had mixed opinions about Keybase, but on the positive side, one lawyer said that they could imagine, for example, putting their Keybase account on their business card or at the bottom of their emails. There are still security concerns and usability challenges that remain with this prototype that we've built. I'll just mention a couple. One is that the transparency with which encryption is done actually made things too easy, and it made people suspicious of the tool. So one person said, for example, because this is so easy, I feel like there must be something wrong. And they said, normally PGP is a rite of passage. I feel like that last quote there is a sobering reminder of how we've done on the usability of these tools so far. Another concern was the fact that using a security tool at all would raise suspicion. So the concern that sources would worry that just using the tool would raise a red flag with their employer. But beyond the Confidante tool itself, I think some of our most important findings from this study were broader. And those findings were that, in fact, despite appearances, journalists and lawyers are actually very different user groups, and they have different operational constraints, and they have different security needs. For example, clients pay lawyers, and so lawyers often felt more comfortable asking those clients to use specific security tools or specific communication tools where journalists are worried about their voluntary sources being scared away. Another difference is that they have different security needs. Journalists in some cases have much stronger requirements. For example, sources might be concerned about the metadata of their communication with journalists, and that's something that Confidante does not protect against, so who is sending messages to whom. But the mere fact that a source is communicating with the press can itself be a damning fact. On the other hand, for lawyers, there are legal protections that come into play instead of pure technical requirements. So many of the lawyers that we talked with told us about attorney-client privilege. And one of the lawyers that we talked with explained it in this way. He said, it's really about the effort that you put in. So if you have a privileged document in your office and someone breaks in and looks at that, then that does not defeat the privilege. That information still cannot be used in court against that client. But if you're negligent with it and you leave it out where anybody can see it, then that privilege is broken. So it's a matter of exerting reasonable precautions, not necessarily having a foolproof technical mechanism to prevent anyone from ever getting at that data. So these are pretty different security requirements, and it means that tools for lawyers can make different trade-offs in terms of usability and functionality than perhaps tools for journalists can. So I'm almost out of time. To recap this specific study, I've told you about these interviews that we did with lawyers and journalists to better understand these specific user groups, their needs and mental models, and the encrypted email tool that we built based on their needs and then took back and evaluated with those specific user groups. Overall, I think this case study illustrates some of the broader lessons that I wanted to bring here. The first is that I think it's really critical that we evaluate and inform the designs of our tools with the needs of specific user groups. And that means not just individual users, but also understanding them in their broader ecosystem, their broader context, like the organizations for whom they work. One of the most important findings from our study, I think, is the fact that one size doesn't necessarily fit all. Different user groups can have entirely different needs for security and functionality in the tools that will work for them. And though it sounds like it's a lot of work to build a different tool for every different group, I actually think that this is a great opportunity because it means that we can build different tools that make different trade-offs that are appropriate in different contexts. And so finally, I would urge all of us to always think about the specific user groups that we imagine that we're building our tools for, and to really understand those groups and iteratively design and evaluate the tools that we're building in those contexts. There are a lot of other really interesting user groups that face unique challenges. For example, we have an upcoming paper studying the interaction of parents and children with connected toys in the home. We heard yesterday about older adults, and I know we're about to hear from Sunny about yet another specific group. So I'm really excited that there's so much interest in studying and building tools that work well to protect the security and privacy of these specific groups. And so with that, I wanted to, again, acknowledge all of my wonderful collaborators and everyone else who's made this work possible. And with that, I will wrap up, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.